We left last episode with China beginning to split into a civil war. The nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-Shek, was unable to reach an agreement with the communist leader, Mao Zedong. Now, it was all in Chiang's favour. His forces outnumbered Mao 5-1. He had the advantage of a better army and navy. His air force was much better resourced. Yet, as I'm sure most of you would know, Mao walks away from this one victorious and emerges as the leader of the new People's Republic of China, while Chiang, on the other hand, is a name forgotten to many in history, well, at least for the West. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at two big questions. Firstly, how did this happen? But I think more importantly, why did this happen? Why could Mao somehow come back from an unwinnable position? If the contents of today's video never happened, just have a think about how different our world would be today. Let's get into it. Okay, so we specifically ended part 1 with Chiang's KMT forces. By the way, KMT is short for Kuomintang, so if you hear KMT, Kuomintang, or nationalist forces, they basically all mean the same thing. But we ended with the KMT invading the northern cities of Mukden and Changchun, which were controlled by Mao's communists after Japan withdrew from those cities. And so China's next door neighbour, Joseph Stalin, decided that now would be the time to act. Even though, like Mao, Stalin was officially a communist, the Soviet leader had decided to stay out of the early days of the Civil War. Now, if Stalin was a textbook communist, he would have joined in straight away on Mao's side, because one of the key points of Marxism is the spread of communism across the globe. But one mistake to avoid in history is to assume that leaders are motivated by an ideology. More often than not, leaders are simply motivated to act in their own interests or in the interests of their country. And so, yes, having a communist neighbour would be nice for Stalin. What would be better would be to have a weak neighbour that actually posed no threat to the Soviet Union. So when it looked like Chiang would unify the country and win the war, that is when Stalin decided to step in on Mao's side. And so Stalin provided Mao's army with crucial arms that really helped transform them from guerrilla soldiers to a modern functional army. There was also more good news for Mao's forces. One of Chiang's key generals, a guy by the name of Hu Zongnan, had had his office infiltrated. You see, his trusted secretary wasn't actually his secretary. Instead, he was really a spy sent by Mao. Now, this spy told Mao that the KMT was next targeting to invade the city of Yan'an. Basically, Yan'an functioned as the capital of the communist side of China. Mao could send heaps of troops to Yan'an to help defend the city, or he could evacuate it and let it go. Mao decided to let the city go and basically played a game of cat and mouse with Chiang. As Chiang's forces advanced beyond the city of Yan'an, Mao knew exactly where they were going. So, at the right time, Chiang's tired soldiers could be ambushed. And this basically undid Chiang's numerical advantage. It was completely redundant because Mao knew every single one of Chiang's moves. So, with Stalin's arms and with some great intel on some of Chiang's attacks, Mao could wrestle back the northeast of China. They took back the city of Changchun, advanced towards the then capital of China, Nanjing, and were just 30 miles outside the city. The communists also took over the city of Tianjin and had well and truly pushed the nationalists back down towards the south of China. The war was now well and truly in Mao's hands. But we really do still need to consider why. Why could the war change hands that easily? Was it simply down to receiving Papa Joseph's weapons? Was it simply down to Mao doing some great spying? Or were there other reasons that changed the war? And to answer that question, we need to look at Chiang's side of things. Chiang made some bad decisions. And his first one was probably annoying the USA. Now, the USA were heavily anti-communist, so it really wasn't that hard to get them on side, but Chiang just repeatedly dropped the ball and ignored instructions and just assumed that Truman and Marshall would be cool with him doing whatever he wanted. Remember, Truman wanted a united China more than a nationalist China, and so Chiang repeatedly ignoring Marshall's orders won him no favours with Truman. The USA reduced the supply of arms to Chiang and decided not to use their own soldiers in the fight. Now, any hopes of American involvement were dashed in 1948 when Truman surprisingly won re-election against the more pro-nationalist and pro-Chiang Republicans. Chiang also promoted some pretty incompetent generals. Remember, one of them was none the wiser that his secretary was a spy sent from Mao. Chiang's strategy was to promote generals that would be loyal to him rather than promoting generals on merit. So sure, it prevented the military turning against him because everyone owed their positions to Chiang, but it meant they had far from the best possible army. Chiang also lost the support of many relatively neutral peasants that defected to the communists. In order to gain the approval of powerful landlords, he more or less turned a blind eye to the poor way they treated the peasants. An American journalist, Jack Belden, reported on a case of roughly 24 peasants being dug out of a pit after being buried alive by their landlord. and it was cases like this that Chiang turned a blind eye to. Now, under Chiang's leadership, China also experienced hyperinflation. For example, the cost of living in Shanghai in 1947 was 900 times that of 1931 when war with Japan broke out. KMT soldiers were treated terribly. Many died on their marches, many were illiterate and unsure why they were fighting, and when you combine those two factors together, there were a lot of KMT soldiers really not happy and defecting to Mao's communists. Not to mention that Chiang's KMT forces had raped and pillaged cities like Changchun, so when Mao came to take them back, Mao's forces were seen as liberators. Now, before Mao could take the capital of Nanjing, Chiang realised the game was up and resigned as the president of China. He initially retreated to Shanghai, but as Mao's army took over Beijing and then eventually Nanjing, Chiang fled to Taiwan. In the end, there were 1.5 million casualties for Chiang's KMT, while Mao only suffered 250,000. Chiang started from an advantage of 5 to 1, then he had an advantage of 3 to 1, then he ultimately lost from an unlosable position. He retreated to Taiwan and with US support would govern the island of Taiwan until his death in 1975. And while Mao is to be praised for his clever cat and mouse approach and his ability to win the support of the peasants, I think it's fair to say that this war was lost by Chiang rather than won by Mao. People say that if Chiang had won, China never would have gone through the atrocities of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, but I really don't know. Chiang was both incompetent and brutal towards peasants. I'm far from convinced he would have had a spotless human rights record, nor would have dealt well with a famine. Nonetheless, Chiang lost, and in October of 1949, the new People's Republic of China was proclaimed, and the war was officially over by December 1949. One of the most eventful reigns in human history was about to begin. Stay tuned for our next episode where we look at the beginning of Mao's reign and actually see how a revolutionary goes about governing a country. Make sure to hit subscribe and notifications if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.